Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, that's on February the 24th. And finally to Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of those dates. The link will be in the description below. We're really excited to see you there.
We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive safely. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnard Castle town. We did not visit the castle, we did not walk around the town. We parked by a river. My wife and I discussed the situation. We agreed that I could drive safely, we should turn around and go home. I felt a bit sick. We walked about 10 to 15 metres from the car to the riverbank nearby. We sat there for about 15 minutes. We had no interactions with anybody. I felt better. We returned to the car. An elderly gentleman walking nearby appeared to recognise me. My wife wished him happy Easter from a distance, but we had no other interaction.
And that, in case you hadn't guessed it, was Dominic Cummings, replete with birdsong in the Downing Street garden, explaining why he'd had to go for a drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. That is among the many what-ifs we're going to try to answer in this episode. What if he hadn't? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we're going to come to Dominic Cummings and the Rose Garden and the multifarious excuses that he made at the time. But we're not starting there. We're starting with something that happened in 1984, which I think could legitimately have changed the whole course of British history and perhaps of the history of the United Kingdom.
This is a nice festive question from Finola, who asks us, what do you think would have happened if the IRA had assassinated Margaret Thatcher, which of course is what they were trying to do, in the 1984 Brighton bombing at the Conservative Party conference of that year? How would the media have reacted? Who would have become the next Prime Minister? Would privatisation of the railways, water, gas, electricity, etc. still have happened?
Fascinating question. My first full year as a journalist, as a working journalist.
Did you cover it?
No, I didn't. There? I was working in the local radio station in Southampton, and we shared the building with the TV station. And the early morning reporter who did the news for the region, which covered Brighton, arrived late to find the overall editor in there. And he says to this guy, Richard Horrobin, "Richard, you're in early. Anything happened overnight?" And Horrobin said to him, "Yeah. They tried to kill the cabinet in Brighton." And that was the end of that bloke's career for arriving late that morning. And it was a kind of salutary lesson.
So it would have been even worse for him. That's the first what if.
Yeah, it would have been even worse. Very bad for the person in question, who never came back.
But for younger listeners who might not be familiar with the events, basically, to cut a long story short, this was basically the most audacious attempt to basically assassinate the whole British government since the gunpowder plot. It was a bomb which was planted in the Grand Hotel in Brighton by the IRA. For a long time, in the years leading up to 1984, Margaret Thatcher had been number one on the IRA's kill list, number one political target to be assassinated. And the intention was, hopefully, not just to kill her, but the whole British cabinet who were all staying at this hotel for the Conservative Party conference of that year. And indeed, some were killed, some were maimed, some were wounded. But Thatcher, just by virtue of where her room was and where the bomb exploded, survived. And she came out the next day with a famous speech where she insisted that the conference would continue, it would go on, and democracy would not be deterred.
Our first thoughts must at once be for those who died and for those who are now in hospital recovering from their injuries. But the bomb attack clearly signified more than this. It was an attempt not only to disrupt and terminate our conference, it was an attempt to cripple Her Majesty's democratically elected government. That is the scale of the outrage in which we have all shared. And the fact that we are gathered here now, shocked, but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail.
Yeah, we should say that 5 people died, 30 were injured, and we thought quite carefully about doing this as a what's if because there is a real horrendous tragedy at the heart of this, which is an act of terror on, a hotel during the party conference season. And I think it is worth understanding a little bit about, the sliding doors moment, because the bomb had actually been placed there some 3 months before. This is incredible. These are all the things that sort of go into what if. It had been placed in the hotel months before with a carefully selected timing and the device to trigger during the conference. The conference was, I think, from the 9th to the 12th of October. And as often happened, Margaret Thatcher was working very late. She was working on her speech. They probably knew that she was somebody who, wouldn't be sort of early to bed, but they set it to go off at 2:54. And it just so happened that Margaret Thatcher had gone to the bathroom 2 minutes earlier. And she had returned from the bathroom in her hotel room at 2:52, and the bomb went off 2 minutes later. Now, there is a very good chance that if her bathroom break had been timed 2 minutes later, she would have taken the full force of it, because the member of her cabinet, Norman Tebbit, and his wife, who was very badly hurt, she was paralysed from the neck down, went through the most almighty fall because a chimney top actually came through the ceiling. Do you remember this? There was a 5-ton chimney top was affected in the blast, and it came right through a whole series of rooms where the bathrooms were. I think it was like the 28 rooms and the 29 rooms, and they plummeted to the floor, and she ended up being paralysed. So the kind of what if of this is an extraordinary thing, because it could have come down to 2 minutes.
Of course, this was a period before there was the internet. There was a period before you had rolling news channels. There was no Sky TV. There was no BBC News Channel at this stage. But all the kind of the BBC and ITV were rolling on the efforts by the fire brigade to get Norman Tebbit out of the building, and the kind of
they were under the rubble. It was like an earthquake,
yes,
almost, wasn't it?
It was just terrible. And to see this kind of preeminent figure of the Thatcher cabinet, and the most Thatcherite, arguably, of the Thatcher cabinet, being pulled out of the rubble like that in obvious distress, it was really shocking. Those images stay with me. And then, Thatcher kind of calling the reporters together, as you say, Lewis, to say that the conference goes on. But John Wakeham, who was in the cabinet, I mean, his wife died in it, Roberta Wakeham, and it was a really shocking moment. And the most chilling of all, actually, was the IRA statement that came afterwards, where they said, "Today we were unlucky, but we only have to be lucky once."
You have to be lucky every single day.
And in that statement, you realise the vulnerability of democracy, and how, determined, well-organised, well-armed, well-funded terrorist groups can do that, and the IRA at that stage could.
But it came up against the organisation of the Conservative Party, who, do you know what they did? The first thing they did the next morning, they marched everyone off to Marks and Spencer. They got Marks and Spencer to open early to get everyone clothes, because obviously, a lot of stuff had been ripped to shreds. They didn't have anything, so they did Marks and Spencer. And Thatcher decided she'd had to go to, I think it was Lewes Police Station. They'd all been taken away from the scene for protection, and she then arrived on no sleep and gave the opening speech of the conference at 9:30 that morning, a mere 6 hours after the blast had taken out the Grand Hotel.
But had it succeeded, this is the what if bit, had it succeeded, it would have been titanic in its effects. It would have been the first British Prime Minister assassinated since Spencer Perceval, 200 years. And I think its political ramifications, certainly in the short term, we can talk longer term, I think would have been seismic. Clearly, there would then have had to be an emergency election for a new Prime Minister, a new, not general election, but the Conservative MPs would have had to choose. I think in answer to that bit of the question, I think it would have probably either been her deputy, Willie Whitelaw, or possibly Geoffrey Howe, her Foreign Secretary, 2 senior members of the cabinet. They would probably have taken over. And it would have, as we've already alluded to, this was a period where the IRA was a constant shadow in British politics, but one that, obviously the Troubles had been raging properly for 10, 15 years and had, huge effects in Northern Ireland. It did trouble the quote-unquote mainland from time to time, and there were plenty of examples of that, Birmingham pub bombings among other things previously. But many people in Britain either wouldn't necessarily understand what was going on or wouldn't care about it that much. This would have put this issue completely foursquare in front of the British public, because their own Prime Minister would have been assassinated from it. And I think that the effect, just if we take the effect on Ireland, for example, in Northern Ireland, it would have been blood-curdling, I think, in terms of the reaction in violence, particularly from unionists and unionism in Ireland. It would have been striking. And you would definitely not have got, I suspect, well, definitely, is you wouldn't have got the next year the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which Margaret Thatcher championed, although later came to regret it, she said, was a key stepping stone on the Northern Ireland peace process, because it allowed for the first time the Republic to have a consultative role in what was going on in Northern Ireland, and at the same time the Republic recognised that the Northern Ireland would remain British as long as the majority wanted to. And it was the first step that eventually culminated in the Good Friday Agreement. And I think had this happened, I think that peace process inevitably would have worked out very differently.
Exactly. So, I mean, your question is about the policies, and the policies is hard to know whether they would have carried on with privatisation and all the rest of it. I think that anything that looked like you were changing course because of a bomb that had been placed at the Grand Hotel would have been impossible. You would have doubled down and said, no, we have been democratically elected at the 1983 landslide victory election, post-Falklands War, to do these things. We are going to do them. And we're not going to change policy because of an IRA bomb. But I think it's the longer term aspect of that. And I was sent out to, first time I went to Belfast, was just after the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And everywhere you went was Ulster says no, slogans on the wall. And it was, and that agreement signed by Thatcher and Garret Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach in the Republic, was a really important part. But it would have been impossible. It would have been impossible to have any kind of back-channel negotiations if they had taken out Thatcher and the rest of the cabinet. And, I think it was a jolt. This comes not that long after we'd had the hunger strikes in the Maze prison and the death of Bobby Sands and all those other hunger strikers. Exactly. It just seemed like everything was going in the wrong direction. And, it was a terrible thing that happened. But maybe it did pave the way for something that was slightly more positive at the end of it.
I find that the most chilling question of all, really. And you're right, we don't know whether she would have privatised, whether the
privatisation had already started, so I think that would have
what I think we do know is that if she hadn't survived, there would have been a massive rally to the flag moment in which, the image of everything she stood for would have been felt even more strongly by her party and quite possibly
be a martyr.
By the country, exactly. But I do think it opens the door to something really uncomfortable. And in a way, we were discussing this last week with the question of the healthcare executive who was gunned down, in the middle of New York, and whether, enough anger could sort of start to legitimise or justify these actions. They never can, of course. But I think when you're starting to question whether an act of terror, even a sort of 60% successful act of terror, is then changing the world, you are essentially opening the door to saying, yeah, well, guess what? It does work. It does actually work.
I think, again, it's difficult to know for sure, but I think it's certainly true that Margaret Thatcher, because she was Prime Minister for so long, and in this scenario she would have only been Prime Minister for 5 years as opposed to 11 and a half. It is cliche to say, but it is true. She transformed British politics in that time. She transformed the Conservative Party. I think it is entirely possible and credible to imagine that if someone like Geoffrey Howe or Whitelaw had succeeded her, much more emollient figures, much less Eurosceptic, as she later became, I think you can imagine that the politics of the Conservative Party, particularly with regards to Euroscepticism, which she embedded towards the end of her time, might have ended up being quite different. I think that some of the dynamics of the Conservative Party and modern British politics would have been different had she not.
Would they have had the appetite for the miners' strike?
Yeah, that's a really interesting
Would they
question.
have shut down? Would they have seen through the strikes that dominated the 80s, that ended coal production in our country?
Can I just say something? There's a very interesting idea that we have now in British politics of the Deputy Prime Minister. We had it with Nick Clegg, he was the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner. Now, during Thatcher's period, there was never an acknowledgement of that. Geoffrey Howe was latterly given the title Deputy Prime Minister when he was moved from being Foreign Secretary and to be Leader of the House and Deputy Prime Minister. And Bernard Ingham, at the Downing Street briefing...
Her press secretary,
and I was there, said, oh, it's just a title. It doesn't have any meaning in the Constitution. There was no idea of the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah, it would have been a very open question about who would have succeeded her. And I suspect...
But Whitelaw was her de facto deputy.
But he was de facto deputy, but he was the sort of wet who didn't have the political muscle in the cabinet, particularly after the 83 election, when, you know, it was the right that was in the ascendancy then. Yeah, so I think it very unlikely that Whitelaw would have become.
Oh, I disagree. I think he would. I think, you know why? Because I think that in those circumstances you'd need someone as an emergency. You know, you could have no
it
like
would be
prolonged.
A temporary. It would be a
maybe
holding.
He may not have been prime minister for very long, but I think someone like him or Howe would have been.
Well, what you're asking basically is, would they have gone on to win an A7?
But I suppose that the scar of the miners' strike was that they had, you know, the Heath government had been held to ransom and ultimately fell because of the failure to deal with the National Union of Mine Workers and Scargill and all the rest of it. And that they were determined that this time they would be better prepared. They had the right people running the National Coal Board as it was then. They had got the police on side. They were ready to do this battle that led to Orgreave and all the rest of it later on.
And what you're basically asking with this question in terms of the British domestic political effects is how much of the reformers of the 80s were structural and coming, and how much of it was about her personality and particular political drive and conviction. And I think the answer to it is basically it's a bit of both. You know, if you see what's happening in the United States, Reagan, so on, these reforms, privatisations, this move to the market, inevitably, it's happening around the world. But Thatcher did it in a particular way and within a certain style, which was to have very long-lasting repercussions. You probably wouldn't have got the council tax. There was one last thing, though, before we move on to the next one. There was one last lingering effect it did have. You know what she carried in her handbag for the rest of her life after that? She carried a little torch. This was in the Charles Moore biography that came out with her. She carried for the rest of her life a torch in her handbag, just in case there was ever another bomb and she needed to have some light to be able to see where she was going.
We'll be back after the break.
This is Matthew calling from Malta. Ex-Londoner, now back in my home country, pretty much after Brexit. My question, what if? What if David Miliband was elected Labour leader as opposed to his brother Ed Miliband? Think about it. No millstone with a manifesto, no bacon sandwich disasters, no hell yeah I'm strong enough in front of Jeremy Paxman. I wonder what would have happened. Something tells me that David Miliband would have resonated much stronger than his brother with voters, and perhaps there might never have been Brexit. But we're all waiting to hear what you think, so over to you. Love the show. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matthew from Malta, for that question.
The most popular question, by the way, I think we've had.
It is, isn't it? And it was such a fascinating period of this kind of Cain and Abel struggle between two brothers for, you know, who was going to lead the Labour Party.
And a good what if, because it was so narrow. You know, literally a few votes in the trade union bloc of the Electoral College at that time, and it would have been David Miliband.
Well, if David Miliband had just got a handful more MPs, he would have won.
Yeah.
And there were various people, one of whom I was with at the weekend, actually, who was, you know, who David Miliband never bothered to contact. And there was a sort of I know David very well, and I would say he's a kind of friend of mine. And I think that he made mistakes in his campaigning. And I think that, you know, I know it is always easy to say, God, if only David Miliband had won the Labour leadership, everything would have been different. Actually, David had various opportunities along the way and didn't quite seize them. And when his brother entered the race, he was too hands off and had been Foreign Secretary and was maybe a tiny bit too aloof imperious and not speaking to enough people, schmoozing them, putting his arm around them and saying, I really need your support.
I was presenting the BBC Two special for the leadership on the day that both brothers emerged, and I was with somebody who I won't name, who is still at the BBC, who was watching the two brothers' faces and said, oh, look, David Miliband's really smiling. He's definitely won it, you know, before they came out. And I said, yeah. You don't smile if you've just won it and your brother's standing there. That means he's lost. And Ed Miliband was looking very troubled and sort of concerned, probably thinking about their mum. And obviously, as soon as it was announced, it was clear that Ed Miliband had been covering up the fact that he knew he'd won, and David Miliband was covering up the fact that he knew he'd lost, and history was written. The thing I would say, and I think people forget this, is that David Miliband, in retrospect, seems like the stronger character, but he pulled his punches on a couple of occasions, which I think were quite memorable. One was when he thought he would take on Gordon Brown, and it was a year earlier, just the beginning of the summer, and he wrote this article for The Guardian. Do you remember this?
Absolutely.
And everyone kind of girded their loins. Is that the phrase? They were sort of waiting for the attack. It's like, oh, this is it. He's written the piece. He's going to go for it.
Do you gird any other part of your body, or is it only your loins?
No, I
Is that
don't
another
know
what
how
if?
you gird.
I don't know.
What if we girded our loins?
Girded.
Yeah.
But that was the moment, I think, where people thought he's going to strike. The
And this is
iron
when
is
Brown
hot.
was really unpopular.
Brown was really
And there
unpopular.
was a second occasion.
Right. And for everyone talking about the bacon sandwich...
He had the banana moment.
Yeah, exactly. The banana... David, they've all got these weird moments of standing with inanimate objects.
He was
David
photographing the
Miliband,
banana.
photograph of the banana, the year before, the October before, at the conference.
But there was
at Labour
also,
I think
conference.
sunk him.
but there was the moment of the kind of the failed coup, which is when James Pennell resigned from Gordon Brown's government. He was Work and Pension Secretary at the time.
On the day of the local elections.
Was a Blairite minister in a Brown government, and this was meant to be the firing of the starting gun. I don't think it had ever been plotted. I think James assumed that David would think, right, this is my moment.
Yeah.
This is where I declare my... And he didn't, and he dithered.
Exactly.
And would he? Wouldn't he?
And
so-
politics is all about... It's not just
Seizing
about
the moment.
Yeah, it's not
He
just
could
about
have
the
been
right
Prime Minister
person.
then. I'm gonna say, I don't know, you two might disagree. I think this is one of the most overblown what ifs of recent political history, because I think actually I find it very difficult to see any other circumstance in which things hadn't been exactly the same. I think things would have been exactly the same, and I think that for a few reasons. One is what you've already alluded to, which is actually people forget now that David Miliband, who is, very accomplished man, as you say, John, very clever, all those sort of things, he had a lot of political frailties and weaknesses, which partly led him not to get the actual either the premiership or the leadership in the first place, right? And it's very easy to be king over the water. People forget now that in 2010, one of the reasons that people started talking up Ed Miliband was the idea that David Miliband was aloof, that he was robotic, that he was difficult. And Ed, in that famous phrase, it was said, talks human, right? So you would have had a situation in which David Miliband's political frailties would have been there rather than Ed. But the other reason, I think, if we're talking big picture, i.e. would the 2015 general election have been different, my argument would be to say no, it wouldn't. Because the big driving factors of the 2015 general election were twofold. One was that the Labour Party was still very much associated with the financial crash, and Miliband, David, would have been probably even more associated with it because he was more senior in the government. And secondly, it was the Scotland referendum of 2014, and that would have been exactly the same. I don't think there would have been any prospect with David Miliband leading that you still wouldn't have had the SNP winning 56 of 59 seats, and I don't think there would have been any prospect, therefore, that David Cameron wouldn't have been able to do exactly what he did, which is to say, as they did with Ed Miliband, David Miliband will be in Alex Salmond's pockets, you need to vote Conservative in England. I think those dynamics would have basically led more or less, maybe Labour might have done a bit better, who knows, but would have led to basically the same outcome.
I tell you one thing where it would have been different, and markedly different, and it goes back to something we have spoken about on the podcast, because, of course, with Ed Miliband as leader of the opposition, he had got in on hostility, in part, to the Iraq War and the failures of policy of Blair, which was a sort of covert way of attacking his brother, because, of course, his brother was so involved in the Blair government and then as Foreign Secretary. I think that if David Miliband had been leader of the opposition when the Syria vote came up about using British Air Force to support Americans in a strike after Assad had used chemical weapons, Miliband no way would have voted against that. I think he understood the American context. He was close to the Obama people. The Obama people were absolutely seething with the Labour Party. And it really did lead to a breach in relations after Ed Miliband said we shouldn't support military action because it left Obama nowhere to go.
Although Obama has said since that he was already having doubts about it even before that happened.
But if you think of how closely the one area where the special relationship is real is in intelligence sharing, is in national security, is in defence. And there were generals who had worked very closely, the very most senior people in the Pentagon had worked very closely with the British, who couldn't believe that the British Parliament had done the dirty on them and left them high and dry. And I think that's an area where if David Miliband had been elected leader, it would have been different.
Am I allowed to mention Eric Joyce at this point?
Oh, go.
That is the other question of the butterfly effect on the Miliband brothers. In other words, Eric Joyce was, if he's ringing a bell or a tiny bell, he's the man who got drunk and punched somebody in the Strangers Bar in the Commons. And the butterfly effect has it that if Joyce hadn't kicked off then the nation would look different because it led to an infamous selection fight in Falkirk, Eric Joyce's seat. And the rules of the contest changed to the point where new rules were drawn up for membership, which allowed the so-called £3 membership, getting lots of people in, one member, one vote, and paving the way, many would say, for Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I think the thing you have to remember about Sliding Doors is that actually the ending is always the same, right? In the actual film, the ending is the same. So maybe Corbyn gets in all the same. He gets in because David Miliband is seen as the warmonger, right? He gets in because there isn't enough difference between Labour and the Tories at the time of Cameron and Miliband. So there are 100 different ways.
So maybe the what if is not Miliband brothers who would have won the next election. Miliband brothers, would you have ever had Jeremy Corbyn?
I think the Eric Joyce thing is the better what if rather than.
We should get Maitlis to write the what if question.
No, I think we've had the Eric Joyce as well. Yeah. I'm sure we've had the Eric Joyce. I was just kind of.
If he decided to stay at home that night and not throwing that punch, who knows? But if David Miliband had been there, you can imagine him doing similar things. I mean, there had been pressure. The right of the Labour Party, including Tony Blair, were the ones who welcomed one member, one vote. Tony Blair hailed Ed Miliband at the time as saying this was a fantastic point.
Sadiq Khan was one of the ones who voted for.
Well, it was seen as a way of limiting the power of the trade unions.
And in the end, it brought Corbyn to office.
I tell you what's really interesting is that we're doing the what ifs, but increasingly, no politician will go there themselves. Right? No politician will ever go, oh, you're right, I should have greenlit the Commons vote. Oh, you're right, I should have been a bit harder. Oh, you're absolutely right. They can't do that. I don't know whether that's a modern thing. I don't know whether it's since Tony Blair and the Iraq War, no one can ever go back and go, yeah, I guess that was my fuck up.
The interesting thing is, as a postscript to all of this, is that the damage that it's done to the relationship between two brothers. And I haven't really heard either of them speak truly candidly about it, but I do believe that the rift is pretty permanent between the two of them.
Siblings, listen to this. Yeah. It is not worth it. Look after your mothers.
Well, there is an argument to be had. I mean,
don't
absolutely.
Waste your life on politics, for Christ's sake.
In a moment, the what if you've been waiting for. Dominic Cummings, eyesight, glasses, Barnard Castle.
Hey, this is Tolly in Brighton on a very cold dog walk. My question is to do with Dominic Cummings and his eyesight. What would have happened if he didn't have eye problems and didn't have to go to Barnard Castle to test his eyes? Would the rules have fallen apart anyway? I can remember when it happened. I was down in Brighton Beach, and he was giving his talk, and it was clear that they were dead and buried as terms of rules went. But yeah, I would like to know your thoughts. Thanks a lot. I love the programme. Cheers.
Well, thank you, Tolly. Thank you for taking us back to those magical weeks.
Yeah.
Watching that press conference.
It was a beautiful day.
Were either of you in the Downing Street Garden then?
No, we weren't invited. Weirdly.
Funny enough. Newsnight being something of a thorn in the side
enemy of the people.
Sort of.
I think, in a way, I think the premise of the question is to suggest that moment kind of crystallised something where the rules started to fall apart. But actually, I don't. That isn't true. Actually, I think that's something we kind of remember. But it is. I mean, if you remember, that was in the middle of the first lockdown, quite early on in the first lockdown. Actually, it was in May, and the lockdown to one form or other lasted until late June, early July. And we had 2 more after that, all with compliance of the rules, which I think surprised many of us over a long time. The British public were very, very keen to follow the rules, albeit extremely angry that Cummings and people like Cummings weren't following it. I think it's certainly true to say
it ended a period of trust.
It ended a period of trust and ended a period where the government was being hailed actually quite often and lauded, and it marked the beginning of a decline which we now know would reveal all sorts of rule breaking and so on. So insofar as it was actually symptomatic of a wider problem in Downing Street, then it was very consequential. The actual events with regards to the visit and so on were less consequential.
I think it also told us something very early on about Boris Johnson's response to those around him and his loyalty,
Yeah, totally.
which ultimately became his downfall. You know, he backed Cummings, he probably shouldn't have. He then went on, you know, a year later, to back Owen Paterson. He then went on to back the groper, Chris Pincher. He then, you know, so I think if we had been aware then of Johnson's propensity to back the rogues around him that were not doing him any good, then maybe we would have understood the story, you know, a little bit earlier.
I mean, in a way, I think the question is, it's centred around Cummings. I think obviously there is a bigger question, which is because the Cummings behaviour was symptomatic of the wider administration. There is a bigger question about whether, obviously, if Partygate hadn't happened, if Johnson had been Prime Minister, but he and those around him had a less lax approach to the rules, if someone like Theresa May had been, and therefore I think it is entirely credible that Johnson would have remained as Prime Minister, because ultimately it was that brought him down more than anything else. And, you know, in that case, recent political history could have been quite different, because you would have had
Well, maybe they're connected. Maybe you could say that the fact that they kind of got away with the Barnard Castle stuff, they did get away with it. You know, Cummings didn't resign. We moved on. There were more lockdowns.
Yeah,
Boris
possibly.
Johnson stayed in power.
Yeah,
maybe that paved the way for more kind of
the old
egregious
phrase.
behaviour.
The old phrase in politics is you choose your friends with care and you choose your enemies even more carefully.
Yeah.
And actually,
exactly.
with Dominic Cummings, what happens there is that this is the beginning of the end of Cummings. He's badly advising you. He's let you down. You know, the voices in Boris Johnson's other ear from Carrie saying he's got to go. And then you get rid of Cummings and he is the nightmare from hell.
Yeah.
From that moment onwards, utterly determined to bring Johnson down. And again, you alluded to it. It's the question of judgment about who you get behind, who you back. And Dominic Cummings was a really bad person to make an enemy of, and made himself an absolute.
So maybe Johnson's downfall was delayed by a year because he did back him originally.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, yeah, I think you're totally right, John. Basically, this is the start of the enmity between them. I think then the question is if that hadn't happened, would that relationship have exploded at some point anyway? And I think it probably would, because you cannot imagine two people with more main character energy than Cummings and Johnson. You know, they have to be the main character in their own story. And Downing Street, I think, probably literally was not big enough for the two of them. Not least because Cummings and Johnson actually had very different visions for kind of what they wanted to do in government. Cummings was a complete radical. He wanted to reshape and rewire the British state.
Cummings is sort of closer to a Musk figure now, really, isn't he?
Completely constant revolution. That was never going to be Johnson, who wanted a quieter life and everyone just to sort of be happy and sort of merrily roll along.
But do you remember Michael Gove at the time was asked about Cummings' behaviour, and he gave this extraordinary defence, which was like, isn't it wonderful that a father would do that for their child?
I mean, I remember.
It was beyond belief.
It was
the
beyond
kind
belief.
of crap that people were coming out with.
And I think it was deeply undermining of the legitimacy of the government, because you had people who were, you know, you had Hancock who'd been going out doing press conferences. Remember that time? You know, day after day, afternoon after afternoon, press conference after press conference, telling everybody how important it was to obey the rules. And then you had the health secretary, in a way that he didn't need to, but let's be honest, he did so because he thought he wanted Cummings' patronage, coming out and saying, oh, he was doing what any father would. What a great guy. I mean, you know, absolutely crazy.
If only there had been,
hypocrisy
there had been a BBC Two current affairs programme that could have held him to account, like Newsnight.
Oh, where were we?
That's the big what if. Let's not get into that. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
Where would the newsagents be now?
Yeah.
Bye for now.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.